Hello everybody and welcome back to the 7-County Witch Hunt Project podcast. We have reached episode 5. I am Mark Norman, folklorist and author and your guide on this journey through the witch hunts of the 7 counties. Joining me in our coffee shop once again for this chat, Marion Gibson. Hello.
Hello.
And Tabitha Stanmore. Hello. Welcome back to both of you. Now at the end of episode 4, I promised you a slightly different angle for this episode, one that is not normally associated with the witch hunts and witch trials, and that is the impact of the environment generally and environmental change. Tabitha, you are predominantly responsible for introducing this theme into the project. I am led to understand, why did you decide to look at environmental change and its impact on the witch hunts?
I think because it's a factor that most people just don't recognise as being important for most studies of history, to be fair. It's not just witch history, it's most of our whether we're looking at economics or political or even war history, environment does sometimes get mentioned if there's a big storm or something like that, but the rest of the time it's just not seen as very important. But I think living in the Anthropocene as we are and sort of seeing the impact of the environment when it goes wrong around us quite a lot now, it's become something that academics have become more interested in as a factor, but also something that I think we're recognising is very, very important for the way that we live our lives and was always an important part of how people before us lived their lives, especially in the early modern period when people weren't insulated from their environment in the same way that we are now a lot of the time. So it seemed like an important part of the puzzle, even if it's not necessarily one which would be directly impacting what was happening when people were accusing each other, although sometimes I think that was a major part of it. It's still something that would have affected people's way of life and their experiences and potentially their responses to things going wrong.
So speaking as a folklorist, I guess when we talk about the environment in terms of folklore and story narratives, we're really looking at kind of the interpretation of environmental factors in a legendary way. I'm thinking of something like the devil visiting Widdicombe Church in 1638 being linked to the Great Storm and potentially ball lightning, some kind of thing like that. The same with black dog folklore with Bungay, for example. But are you looking at it in slightly different terms to that?
That's definitely a part of it, yeah. Obviously there are lots of witch accusations that do centre on a storm or, for example, John Lowes' ship sinking. There must be an environmental factor to that, and that is important. But no, I do think there is a sort of broader aspect to this, which is, what was going on with the climate at the time, for example. People were living in the middle of the Little Ice Age in the 1640s, and that would have had an impact on their crops, whether their harvests were successful or whether they failed. And it would have also changed, the seasons to a certain extent. It would have made people more reliant on fuel over the winter because winters would have been harsher. So there is that kind of longer term aspect to this that needs to be factored in as well.
So when we think about the witch hunts more generally, what kind of importance can we put on the environment as a factor? I know there are a couple of different theories that you can explore in terms of this, which again are perhaps not at first glance ideas that you would necessarily relate to the environment per se. So talk about those.
Okay. So there have been environmental explanations forwarded for the witch hunts across Europe in the past. For example, the idea of ergot poisoning being one of the reasons that people were having hallucinations or experiencing fits and that kind of thing. Ergot is a kind of fungus that grows in rye when you've had a particularly damp summer. So, that could be an explainer for some isolated witchcraft cases. It definitely wouldn't explain everything.
So for example, in terms of that, Marion, just to bring you in so that we remind ourselves that you're here on Tabitha's topic, ergot was definitely cited as a factor, rightly or wrongly, in the Salem trials, right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. And this argument was put forward and has been put forward repeatedly over the years. Every time it's been welcomed as some sort of new revelation, but it isn't actually. It's quite an old idea. And the idea is, that the grain became infected. People ate the grain in their daily lives, in their bread, and so on. And then they began to hallucinate because it's a form of LSD, basically. So you can see why people, particularly say in the 1970s and early 80s, might think, oh, hang on a minute, we can explain all this in terms of our recent experiments with these kind of substances. And whilst it's interesting, it's a really interesting idea, because that sort of physiological explanation is always worth looking at. But at the same time, it surely can't explain everything. It can't explain, for example, the content of people's visions and confessions. And it can't really explain why so many people were experiencing them in, say, different communities. Surely they can't all have been experiencing ergot poisoning. So I think, we'd probably think, as Tabitha says, it might be a factor in a minority of cases, say, which we wouldn't be able to identify, but we might think, well, that's plausible perhaps in a small number of cases, but really the cultural factors seem more important.
And ergot, of course, as you say, comes from rye, and rye is a staple in the food that people are eating at this time in these cases, but then the opposite end of that explanation is that people aren't eating much food at all because the environment has an impact on crops, leading to famine and those kinds of angles. Can you expand on that one a little bit more too?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you say, when famine hits, which was unfortunately an extremely common part of early modern lived experiences across Europe, people would be starving, and that led to all sorts of fears, and hopefully most of these were just fears and fantasies of potential cannibalism in some cases. So especially in some of the Alpine witch trials, there is a lot of reports of not only witches killing children, apologies for more mention of child death, but also potentially eating those children as well, or sort of putting them into sort of big cauldrons and boiling them up and that kind of thing. And again, that idea that people were worried about this has been linked back to potential sort of widespread famine, and kind of maybe fantasies of finding nutrients wherever you can, and that being sort of like the extreme explanation for it. I should say that when it comes to the Seven County Witch Hunt Project, we don't really see very much cannibalism, and I don't think that these, neither ergot nor famine specifically, are environmental factors that we need to kind of put too much emphasis on or even necessarily consider at all. But it does suggest that environment can be very important in witch trials, and therefore we should be applying environmental analysis to these trials as well.
And of course, when we look at folk narrative and folklore, fear plays a big part in those narratives, and we see it in terms of disease outbreak in periods of history, and the fear of cholera leading to folk narratives which tie into that theme, for example. So I suppose it's not too far a step to take, is it, to suggest that fear of poor crops due to environmental factors would lead to similar kinds of narratives in that way. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's very fair.
Yeah. Okay, so focusing down a little bit more from ideas across Europe and Alpine folklore and those sorts of things, to the Seven Counties and the East Anglian hunts themselves, does the environment have that same kind of level of importance there?
Yeah, I think so. I think the environment is important. I'm not going to try to suggest that it was the environment which triggered the witch hunts at all. It's not that sort of big a factor, but it is definitely one that needs to be taken into account, because the environment was changing across this 7-county area. Marion, I think you're going to be talking a bit about herrings, which are fascinating. But the thing that I've got obsessed with over the course of this project is what was happening in the Fens. So the Fenland region, it's a big area that covers parts of Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, Huntingdonshire, and goes up into Lincolnshire as well. And because of the Little Ice Age partly, and potentially land bounce as well, where the land was sort of being compressed and then rising in strange ways. The Fens, which has always been a low-lying wetland area, was becoming more and more flooded in the early 17th century. And that basically encouraged central government to get involved in this big, bold, almost impossible project to drain the Fens. And draining the Fens was something which was deeply disturbing to the people who lived there, because it completely changed their economy and their way of life. And it also came with proposals to enclose major parts of the commons in the Fenland area, which again would have greatly impacted the people who lived there. It would have meant that their livelihoods were sort of on the line, and access to land would change dramatically. And it did change dramatically from the 1620s up until the 1650s. So that environmental factor was definitely affecting the social makeup and the economic makeup of a major part of where the witch trials took place. So I think that's really, really important.
So what cases do we have coming from the Fens that you've examined that feed into this?
So all of the Cambridgeshire cases took place in the Fens. Not the whole of Cambridgeshire is covered in Fens, but the area around Ely and sort of north of Cambridge is all kind of wetland area, basically, as well as some of the Huntingdonshire cases. Strangely, all of the Suffolk cases didn't happen in the Fens, which is interesting in its own right. But yeah, basically anybody I've spoken about so far, for example, John and Bridget Bonham, Margaret Moore, they were all living in a landscape which had been changed over the last 20 years before they were accused. And I think what you're seeing in some of these accusations are responses to that change. For example, John Bonham says that he met the devil in the shape of a mole while he was hedging in a cherry yard or a cherry orchard. And that sounds like an innocuous thing, but the fact that he was hedging probably is pointing towards the idea that the land had recently been enclosed, because hedges weren't a common part of the fen landscape until they were dry enough to be able to plant hedges. And hedges were, across the rest of the country, had been used for a long time as part of the enclosure plans to take away commons. So was John resentful of these hedges being created? Was he actually propping up the enclosure drive that was happening and therefore pitting himself against his neighbours who were losing their commons? And how much should we be factoring that in to his story and the accusation that resulted?
So when we look at the cases that come out of the Fens, are they different in makeup in terms of the type of accusation that's being levelled or the response to that, to the cases that you examine that are outside of that area?
It's very hard to say, because a lot of them do fall into the stereotypical witch accusation. You know, it's selling a soul to the devil, it's meeting your familiar and giving them blood and that kind of thing. So in those ways, no, it's clearly not directly affecting it. But if you understand the context in which these people were living, I do think you can read a little bit more into some of the anecdotes. So, for example, Margaret Moore, who I spoke about in the last episode, when she was visited by her ghost children, they said, "Mother, mother, give me something to drink." And she said, "I have nothing to give you but water." And that might be something to do with the enclosure of the Sutton Common, which is, she lived in Sutton, and the common used to be able to support a lot of commoners' cattle. Once enclosure had happened, there was nowhere to keep that cattle, and so a lot of people lost their access to milk provision. So her poverty might actually be a newfound situation for her that came from the enclosure.
Let's talk about fish. You intimated earlier that Marion wants to discuss herring and that herring are interesting. So therefore, we're going to drill down into precisely why herring are interesting in terms of 17th century witch hunting. Marion.
Particularly because there's a big witch hunt in Great Yarmouth on the Norfolk coast in 1645, and actually there's another one in 1646 as well. And if you go to Great Yarmouth, one of the first things you notice is that this is a town whose entire history is dominated by the herring fishing industry. By the 1620s, there are about 1,000 men, and that's just the men who are in the boats working in that industry. And there are about 200 boats going out to catch the herring. It's a very seasonal industry, so that the herring comes in the summer, basically. But if you think about this period, just as Tabitha was saying, about a period of potential climate change, the Little Ice Age, things are changing across the landscape. And you know, if you add on to that, people are draining. They're draining the fens, they're draining the Broads. They're working in this landscape quite intensively to change it. And at the same time, you've probably got some kind of climatic disruption, as people have argued. That's going to impact on an industry like that. So the argument's been made, I think it's a really interesting one, that maybe the climatic change changes the movements of fish, because certainly you notice going through the 1630s and 1640s, the herring industry is under a tremendous amount of pressure. The catches seem to have declined. The fish don't show up in quite the way that they used to, you know, which is something we hear a lot in modern times, isn't it? And it feels like maybe those people were living in something fairly similar, where inexplicable changes were happening around them. And the kind of industries that they'd relied on in the past were not ones that they could now rely on. So people would, the town's history is so bound up in the history of fish that people would say, oh, the fish is the patron saint of the town. You know, the herring is the patron saint of Yarmouth. And they would say things like the sails of the herring fleet could cover the whole sky. It's such a big fleet. And when you add to the men who were going out to sea, the women who were on the shore, you know, gutting the fish and preparing the fish, and working in all the industries that come off it, whether that's pressing oil out of them or smoking them to make kippers, you know, the red herring, which comes from that part of the world. You've got an entire community that's dependent on that. And it's interesting in the context of the witch hunt, that the witch hunt comes at a time when there is this kind of pressure on the industry in the first place. And then you also get, and I think I talked about this a little bit in a previous episode, you also get pirates coming down to seize some of the herring boats from about 1643 onwards, because they're coming over from the European continent. They're essentially on the royalist side, so they're coming from Catholic, what is now Belgium. And they're actually kidnapping fishers, and they're taking them back, and they're selling their catches on the continent. So suddenly the town's industry is under massive threat. It's essentially gone. They can't go out of the harbour without being grabbed by pirates. And when they do get out there, there's not as much fish for them to catch. It's not mentioned, intriguingly and kind of slightly annoyingly, it's not mentioned by any of the participants in the witch trial. But once you realise there's this massive economic disruption going on in the background, you feel that this has to be a factor in what happened there.
Do we have any standout cases for you coming out of this area, the fishing industry and the coastal area around Great Yarmouth? Are there standout cases for you there?
There are. I mean, the one I talked about most in the book that I'm writing about this is one called Nazareth Facet or Fawcett, which is a great name, isn't it? And again, makes me think about religion, obviously. You know, this is one of the other factors in Great Yarmouth is it is massively religiously conflicted in this period. So here's a woman with a very biblical name. Isn't that fascinating? And she's brought up in front of the town court in the 1630s because she's supposedly been spreading scandal about her neighbours. So she's already on the radar, and her husband is done over at the same sort of time for swearing. So this is a town where they're having a lot of moral reformation. They're trying to stop people, you know, gossiping and fighting with each other and swearing in the streets and behaving. One of the things I thought was, is she a fishwife? I don't know that she is, but maybe she is actually one of the people involved in that industry, and their job is basically to stand in the street screaming their wares, and, you know, behaving like what we would now call a fishwife, i.e. a noisy, assertive woman. Isn't that fascinating? So she's accused of witchcraft. We don't know exactly what she's accused of. The record isn't specific about it, but she is accused of keeping familiar spirits, which we've also talked about in previous episodes. And pretty much everybody in Great Yarmouth lived in the area which was dominated by the fishing industry, called the Rows. These are very narrow little streets that dominated the entire town. There's about 7 miles of rows, and some of them were so narrow that you basically could stretch out your arms on each side and touch each side of the street. So it's a very compacted community, and you can imagine this is a community where there is a lot of conflict. People are spreading scandal about each other. People are falling out. So whilst the connection isn't an obvious one, I think that the background, the climatic background, and the reliance on a particular natural resource in that environment is really, really important in cases like Nazareth. And she's accused alongside a number of other women, and ultimately she does get off, which I think is a nice end to that story, but a lot of the other women are hanged. And then there's another case in 1646 where, again, more people are accused of witchcraft. They're acquitted, but nevertheless there's a lot of turbulence in this area that I feel might very well be related to environmental factors once you start looking at the records.
You mentioned the women working alongside the fishing fleet there, gutting the fish and all those things, and it put me in mind of the herring girls from Scotland. So the herring girls would follow the fishing fleet around the coast performing those tasks, which means that you have a group of people moving as one around the area. And we all know from the way that stories change and develop in folklore and beyond how migration is important in these sorts of things. And I wonder whether we see that in cases like these in Yarmouth. Do we have elements of, I don't know whether herring girls come down that far from Scotland. They do. So we have very distinct Scottish witch trials which have elements to them that we don't necessarily always see in some other areas. And I wonder whether any of these then travel down from Scotland and embed themselves in this area.
That's a great question. I've wondered a lot about this. I don't think it's any coincidence that a lot of the communities we are looking at are East Coast communities which are linked by coastal shipping. And the coal trade is the other one I would point to as well. So they're bringing down coal from Newcastle and Sunderland. And people might know, there's a big witch trial in Newcastle in 1649 to 50. I don't think it's a coincidence. And I think they're probably bringing Scottish ideas, particularly maybe to do with testing of witches. In Scotland, witch pricking is common. You also get in the earlier period, there's a number of cases in the earlier 1640s, but the one I've been most interested in is in a place called Mid Calder in 1643. And there people are examined in a way that very much prefigures the watching and walking that Hopkins and Stern did in the Essex cases, and then they spread this technique out across the counties of the witch hunt. So, the Scottish women are imprisoned in the vestry of a church. They are forcibly walked up and down. They're sometimes stood on a stool in a stressed position. And one of them's kept there for 26 days a night. She's just a hideous thing. And she complains to the Privy Council in Scotland about her treatment and tries to get some justice, and calls the minister and the elders of the church who have been persecuting her to account. So it makes me think, actually, those kind of ideas are probably travelling up and down the coast. And it's interesting when you look at the witchcraft cases, how often, in Newcastle, somebody from Ipswich will be mentioned, and in Ipswich, somebody from Newcastle will be mentioned. And then you've got places like Lowestoft and Aldborough and other places where there are, all along the coast, there are witch trials. You think the ideas are migrating, aren't they? The ideas are migrating with the people, they're migrating with the crews on the boats. And then when you add in cases like John Lowes, who was accused of actually sinking ships along the coast, you realise just how much this is a maritime community and how much people are mobile up and down that coast, taking with them the ideas of witch trials.
I think you can also add to that they're not just connected to other parts of the UK coast, they're also connected to Holland and kind of the Low Countries, which is where a lot of printing presses are that are spreading a lot of very kind of puritanical ideas, and the easiest place for those to be spread to is the east coast of England, right? This might be one of the reasons you don't get the same style of witchcraft or the same intensity of witchcraft on the west side of England, because those ideas aren't so easily spread and received there. And I think you can also see maybe some movement of these ideas across land. And, you can track Stern and Hopkins's movement across the land according to the roads and also the navigable rivers. And it's really interesting. I've been looking at quite a few maps recently of sort of the pre-drained fens and the post-drained fens. And Stern and Hopkins, as they travel across the landscape, they stay on high ground. they are navigating by roads, they're not navigating by boat. And I think that's really interesting. It presumably says something about how confident they were with the lands that they were travelling through. And they also seem to be avoiding areas where there were intense riots against enclosure. So strangely, and I expected this to be the opposite way round, but looking at places like Sutton and Haddenham and Streatham, which were all sort of fenland villages, Sutton did experience some riots in the late 1630s and early 1640s, but nowhere near as intensely as the riots in Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire doesn't seem to have been affected by the witch hunts. And that might be something to do with the fact that the prosecutors weren't interested in going up to that county because it was already so disrupted, is part of my guess. So even the absence of witch hunts could potentially have an environmental factor behind it.
Interesting. I wonder as well, and I don't know whether this is something that you would have necessarily explored at all, but when we look at the coastal areas, whether there is an influence or a tie-in between witchcraft-related stories and stories that are coming out of smuggling. Because there's often a link between folklore that gets embedded on the coast and stories that are generated by smugglers who are either drawing on local folk narratives to create reasons for people to stay away from where they're operating, or they're creating their own stories which then become embedded as narratives themselves. And I wonder whether there's any link between witchcraft narratives and smuggling narratives along the coast.
That's really interesting. I have not thought about that, but I have not investigated, but I have occasionally thought about the links between maritime superstitions and the kind of magical rules you have around what you can and can't have on boats and who's allowed to do what around boats, and ideas of magic and cursing and suspicion, and particularly when you add in the enormous factor of luck, which determines so much about fishing communities, whether you actually do happen on a shoal or not. I have wondered how far that's connected. And there are other examples of coastal communities like Dartmouth having important witchcraft trials earlier in the 17th century. So that would be really interesting to look at. You're right, they're both generators of stories, those areas of activity, aren't they? And what Tabitha said about migration and piracy, and the bringing in of new ideas across the sea, that would apply to smugglers as well, wouldn't it? If you're smuggling, I don't know, brandy, you can also be smuggling Protestant pamphlets, can't you? Yeah. It doesn't really matter whether you care about the contents of them or not, you still bring them in. And you have that wonderful link between the continents and the East Coast, and then of course North America as well, and so those ideas travel across the world in those ways.
So many ideas you can explore if you extend this project further.
Yeah.
So for coming back to focus on the findings from this particular project, then what have you learned about the links between the environment and the narratives which you're pulling out of the archives here? What has this research taught us?
As ever, it's more complicated than it looks. As I said at the beginning, I don't think that this is a one-size-fits-all explanation for the witch hunts. I don't think that it is something that we can even sort of say, the Little Ice Age was a major factor in every single accusation that was made or anything like that. But I do think that environment is important, and the way it intimately affects how people feel. It can make a community feel very, very under pressure and very afraid and lash out in various different ways. If we're going to incorporate the context of the Civil War, if we're going to incorporate the economic things that were going on, the kind of the religious and political situation, we should be factoring in the environment as well. And it might not give us an explanation or an answer a lot of the time, but I think it does provide a lot of context to the things that people were struggling with on a day-to-day basis and how that would have impacted their own beliefs and their fears.
I just so agree with that, and really what she said. That's what I think. I don't think I would have, if you hadn't been on the project, I don't think I would have noticed in the same way that there were these environmental factors. You know, I'd not considered things like fen drainage. I'd not really thought about things like the weather. I'd not thought about movements of fish, you know. And actually that's all really important, isn't it? Because these people's lives are so caught up with the land, with what the weather's like, with whether their crops are being flattened by hailstorms or are blossoming in the sunshine. It's so important to them. And they're so much more connected than we are now. I think it's easy to overlook, but once you've started to look, you can imagine the kind of feelings they might have had in their heads about what was going on around them.
And I think it's so important, and it's so obvious to them that maybe it doesn't get mentioned as much in the records as we might hope or might expect. Because, you know, to them, you know, whether or not their crop has failed or succeeded, if it does seem to have mostly mundane explanations for it and they're not suspecting witchcraft, then they're not going to come to court and say, oh, this is terrible, this has happened to me. They're just going to worry about it. So I think actually, Marion, in the first episode, potentially, you said that, you know, the what isn't spoken about in a community is as important as what is, because there are these big elephants in the room that we don't necessarily notice or realise are there until we start looking for them.
And everybody talks about climate change now, but they don't have a framework for talking about that then. So the silence about that might be because everybody knows it's been a really poor summer. We don't need to mention that factor. That's not why we're accusing our neighbour of witchcraft at all. Whereas what we see would be, oh, hang on a minute, there's this massive thing you're not talking about, and you're simultaneously striking out against somebody else who's done something they couldn't possibly have done. So it looks obvious to us, but to them it was just part of the fabric of their lives.
We've covered a lot of ground over these last 5 episodes, examining the nature of accusation, unpicking the stereotypes around witchcraft, the witch trials, the witch hunting, the way that these families, these communities all operated, and those external factors that we've now explored that might have a bearing on them. In the final episode, we're going to pull all of this together as I ask Tabitha and Marion to highlight some of their favourite stories that they've uncovered during the course of this project, some of the gems that have been hidden in the archives until now, what those stories mean for us, and to wrap the whole thing up by explaining why projects like this are so important and the kinds of findings that they pull together. So do join all of us again in 2 weeks' time for episode 6 when we cover all of that. In the meantime, Marion, Tabitha, thank you very much.
Thank you.